Are you ready to quilt the Hello Baby quilt? We're going to show you how to use the French pillowcase binding technique, as well as do our simple, forgiving, beginner-friendly wave stitching pattern. Let's get going. The French pillowcase binding technique is very different from regular quilting techniques because there is no binding. So we're going to sew around the edge of the quilt and then turn it inside out and then do the quilting at the end. So I'm going to give you step by step the way to make decisions and the strategies for being successful with this technique. And the first decision we need to make is about thread. Now, there are lots of different strategies in terms of choosing threads. We generally suggest that you think about thread is an err on the side of lighter versus darker. Darker, even like a navy or something like that, can look black when it's on white. There's something about when it's quilted, the little valley that's created by the quilting casts a shadow on either side of the thread that makes it look darker. So if you're trying to decide between two threads, you'll often want to look at the one that's a little bit lighter if possible. I looked at blues and grays for this because the blues and blacks and whites are the main colors in this quilt. And I thought about going with the lighter one. But when I looked at the fact that most of the quilt is this navy, the lighter gray looked a little bit whiter than I wanted it to. So I decided to go with the medium gray here. Now, another way that people might think about it would be to try to match the thread to the different sections. So you could, in theory, choose a navy thread that matches the top and then go with a lighter thread for this middle section. And that's definitely a possibility. However, with baby quilts, they're pretty much two-sided quilts. You're going to be seeing the back a lot. So you could do something, depending on the color work, you could do something really intentional and make it look like a different band on the back. And that could be very interesting too. But I've decided I'm just going to stick with this darker gray, and I like the way it looks even on the white because there's all this black with it. So I think it's going to look very intentional. So with that decision out of the way, oh, and I guess the other thing to make sure you think about is how it's going to look on the backing. And so make sure that you check the color and the value, the lightness or darkness of the color on the backing as well. So with that in mind, let's talk about the stitching pattern that we're going to be doing. So one of my favorite quilting patterns for beginners or people who are not as confident as they would like to be about their quilting is a simple wave pattern. And I'm going to suggest that you take any batting scraps that you might have cut off your batting to do a little practice run. Now this is the pattern that I decided that I liked, and this is a way for you to also build up your confidence that you can do this, because you can totally do it, by thinking about how far apart you want these lines to be. Now there's the distance between the lines really affects the drape of the quilt as well. And there are many people who love to put the lines even 1/4 of an inch apart. However, it yields a stiffer quilt. And because this is a baby quilt, and we really want it to be able to drape around the body of the baby really nicely, if it's a car seat or baby's in a stroller or whatever, you want it to be soft and have a really nice drape for the baby. So I would go a little bit wider. Now, if you go too wide, the fabric on the front and back can get wrinkled and it can get a little sloppy looking. So I probably wouldn't advise you to go more than maybe 1 inch apart in the rows of the wave stitching. But again, this is personal preference and how much time you have. But if you think about these lines, They are wavy, but they're still pretty consistent. And especially when we start the quilting process, part of the quilt's going to be rolled up and you're not going to be able to see where you've been as easily as you would like when we're working on a domestic machine. So what I suggest you do is think about adding some chalk lines to the quilt top before we do the rolling step, which I'll explain in a minute. And these will be guidelines that will help you make sure your quilting doesn't go downhill as you progress, because it's easy to get a little bit lost as you're quilting and not remember whether the quilting is actually perpendicular or parallel to the edges of the quilt. And so I'm going to suggest you use either a marking wheel, a chalk wheel like I used, or it can be a water-soluble marker, or it can be school board chalk. Whatever you want to use works great. And you can use your ruler to, I put my lines about every 6 inches or so. Again, there's no specific measurement that's magic here. It's just enough that you want to be able to see when it's unrolled, whether you're starting to go downhill or not. So you can start by putting your ruler on the end and work your way down the quilt, or you can start by putting it on the straight seam that we know is perpendicular, where the piecing starts on the quilt. There's a lot of different ways to do it. I actually also like to put a, let me move this so you can see it. I like to put a center line down the middle of the quilt as well, because that helps me to make sure that I have the same number of waves in general on this side as on this side. Again, there's no specific critical technique here. It's just whatever you need to feel confident that you're able to see whether the quilting is consistent across the quilt. Because the magic of quilting, the really important thing, is not what kind of machine you have, or not what needle you use, or not what thread you use. It's practice and knowing where you are in the quilt. And especially because we're going to be starting in the middle of the quilt, you're not going to be able to use the ends as kind of registration for your quilting. So figure out some way to get some parallel lines down on your quilt, and I'll show you how to prepare the batting and to roll the quilt onto the batting before we do the French pillowcase technique. So I find that the easiest and most stressless way to make the sandwich that is the French pillowcase binding technique is to use a roller of some sort. I'm using my fitness foam roller, and but you can use a pool noodle, you can use a wrapping paper roller, any kind of roller or tube that you can roll the quilt onto will work. Now we're going to be doing our stitching across the short side of the, parallel to the short side of the quilt. So I'm going to roll it on, put the roller here and start rolling, because what we're going to do is we're going to spray the ODIF 505 onto the batting. Now, it's not critical that you use a spray-based adhesive. I find it a little bit easier for a quilt is this size. If I were doing placemats, it wouldn't be necessary, but the batting can sometimes move around if you don't have it stabilized. So I'm just going to continue to roll this on to the tube, and then I'm going to get my batting ready. So I've taken the ODIF 505 and I've gone outside and lightly, very lightly sprayed the batting. It's a very different technique. They recommend you spray the batting. Some spray-based adhesives recommend spraying the back of the quilt, so be sure to read the instructions from the manufacturer. I do a super light, just enough to be tacky, because this is a small quilt and you're not going to have a huge amount of batting moving around when you turn it inside out. Bill and I have done a larger quilt in which we really made sure that we sprayed it much more thoroughly. What I like about the Oda 505 is that it's odorless and it doesn't gum up needles. And that's an important thing since we're going to be quilting after the fact here. And there are no CFCs in here, so that's good. All right, let me show you how we're going to align the top here. Or I guess we can just start with the bottom now since we rolled it up from the top. So I also like that the Oda 505 is repositionable. So it basically turns your batting into a giant post-it note kind of idea. But you don't want to be standing, it will stick onto your clothes, which is not what you want. So what I've done is, because of the length of my arms, is I've put just enough batting here to be able to slightly unroll the roll a little bit at a time. And then I will, kind of like an old school adding machine tape, I will move it forward and then unroll it a little bit more. So let's start. Oh, I guess I should say too, I cut the batting just an inch bigger than the quilt top, and you'll see those directions on the pattern. Okay, so let me get this over here. This is a little bit tricky, so you're going to start by lining up the edge here. And you can see even just now that it's really nice to have the quilt rolled up and not be dealing with all of that yardage all at once. And just center it on the piece of batting. Okay, and you can use your fingernails to get it nice and straight. And then you're just going to lift up the roller so you can flatten it out a little bit at a time. And you're going to be smoothing toward the roller because you've got this edge even, so you don't want to be messing with that. And you're going to continue to smooth toward the roller, and you can see how nice and flat it's lying on the batting, and that's going to really be helpful as you do this technique. Okay, so now we're ready to pull it forward a little bit, advance it, and then unroll a little bit more. So this is I love this roller technique because I just find it so much easier to control the batting as I'm rolling this out. Okay. I'm going to go forward a little bit more. There we go. And now we've got most of it ready, and we can just use our hands at this point to smooth it out. Using the spray base adhesive is not mandatory, but I do find it does help a little bit. And now you're going to see when we get to the end. So it looks like we got a little off kilter here, but that's why you have a slightly bigger piece so you can cut it down. Because the batting is not non-woven, it's okay if it's not 100% straight on there, but it's pretty close. And we can just trim it down now. So before we move forward, we're going to trim down any excess batting, and then we're going to attach it to the back. Okay, so we're just going to trim the batting right to the edge of the quilt. And then we'll get going and sew it to the backing. So I've trimmed down the extra batting, and you can see that this is kind of moving it as one layer now, which makes it a little bit easier. Now, another option, if you don't want to use a spray-based adhesive, is to buy a fusible batting. There are battings that Quilter's Dream, I know, makes one that where you can press the quilt top onto the batting, and it has little fusible dots on the batting that then adhere to the quilt top that also create the same process. So fusible batting would be another way to go if that's what you're interested in. Again, I am using 100% cotton batting. You can use wool or bamboo or polyester or a blend of silk and bamboo or polyester and cotton. There's lots of different battings out there. And but the reason I like cotton is that it drapes really nicely around the baby and it breathes. But the other one that I think is really great for baby quilts is there's a bamboo silk tencel blend that Quilter's Dream sells, and that has a really nice floppiness that's fantastic for swaddling babies and having a really soft floppy quilt. So, but we love cotton, and so we're going to use cotton for this one. Okay, so now that this is all trimmed up, now we're going to put the backing in place. Now, one of the things that I think looks so odd about the way that this is going to work is that we're going to put right sides together with the front of the quilt and the back of the quilt with right sides together, and it's going to look odd for a few minutes because the batting is going to be on the outside of the quilt. However, we're going to sew 3 sides around, turn it inside out, and then it will be in the middle as it should be, and then we'll be able to quilt. So I'm going to go ahead and get the backing positioned so we can sew around those 3 sides. Now I like to pin the batting and all of the layers together. You can use clips as well, but I find that the pins work really nicely. And in the same way that you did with the back, getting the quilt front onto the batting, you're going to just start at the edge and smooth your way down and make sure all of your layers are nicely aligned. And then you're going to grab some pins and just pin strategically, I'd say. Start in the corners. And then go to the center. And you can have as many or as few pins as you like. I think for this step, probably every 6 or 7 inches is about right for me. So I'm going to finish pinning, and then I will meet you over at the sewing machine. So I brought the quilt over, and I'm going to sew with the batting side up. Now I'm going to use a walking foot, and this is a walking foot if you've never used one before. And the nice thing about a walking foot is that because it's got this little gizmo here, what it does is the feed dogs below advance the quilt, and traditional presser foot stays static, and so the feed dogs advance the quilt forward. But when you have a lot of layers like you do with quilts, sometimes the layers start to move at a different speed, and that's not desirable. And what the presser foot does is pushes it together so all of the layers move together. And it just gives you a little bit better tension as you are doing the quilting. However, if you don't have a walking foot, you might want to just experiment with adjusting your tension a little bit to see if you can, if you start having any kind of slipping of layers. Now, one of the other things that you'll hear about is people who drop their feed dogs or don't drop their feed dogs. There are merits to dropping them and merits to leaving them up. Because the pattern that we're doing is relatively forward. We're going to be doing a wave pattern, but we're not going to be coming backward at all. And the reason I'm going to suggest you keep your feed dogs up is it will give you a more consistent stitch length as you quilt. So that's one variable you can knock right out of there in terms of things that might cause you problems. So, and that's also another reason that I love this wave pattern for beginning quilters, is because you're only moving in one direction. So it's a lot easier in terms of muscle memory to just keep going forward than it is to go back if you're stippling or doing some other stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and put my my walking foot back on. The other thing to discuss is your needle. And we don't have any relationship with Schmetz, but we love their quilting needles, and this is the chrome professional grade quilting needle. It's got the pink or red and green stripe on it. So if you don't have a quilting needle and you just have a universal needle, that will work too. So it's just a matter of, sometimes the tools add a little bit, but don't let it be a barrier to you quilting your quilt if you don't have any quilting needles. Just go ahead and use the universal needle. So I'm going to sew 3 sides of the quilt, and then we're going to turn it inside out, and I'll show you how to prepare it for the quilting. I like to have the open part at the bottom of the quilt. So I've pinned it, but I double checked before I put it under the needle to make sure, because it's just a little bit easier to not see the bottom of the quilt, even though this is a baby quilt and it really doesn't have a top and bottom so much. But I just prefer to start at the bottom, go around to the top and the other side, and then we will hand sew the bottom edge after the quilting is done. So we're going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And again, I have a little mark on my walking foot that tells me where a 1/4 inch is. And after we do that, I will take it back over to the cutting table where we will trim down the seam allowance and show you how to prepare it for quilting. So let's get sewing. Oh, I also want to make sure I tell you this trick. Do you see how I have my ironing table here? It's really nice when you have even a small quilt like this to be able to have a wider surface to take 2 things. Both the bulk of it, because sometimes it can start to pull on your sewing machine, but also sometimes the pins poke into your leg as you're sewing. So it's really nice to have extra support. So if you have a height adjustable sewing or ironing board, set it up next to your sewing table, and it's really, really helpful. So when you get close to the corner, visualize a 1/4 inch from this edge and this edge, which is right about there. And when you get to that point, you're going to put your needle down, lift up the presser foot, and turn the whole quilt 90 degrees. And that will make it much easier for you to turn the quilt inside out. So I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so I'm going to put the presser foot up, the needle down, and I'm going to turn the entire quilt 90 degrees, put the presser foot back down, and continue sewing. So now we've sewn 3 sides of the quilt. Here's the open part at the bottom. And now we're going to trim the 1/4 inch seam allowance of the batting. It just makes the quilt a little bit bulkier. So we're going to use a slightly smaller scissor, and we're going to trim that all the way to the stitching. Be careful not to cut the seam allowance of the quilt itself, of the front and back. You just want to get in there with a smaller pair of scissors and get right in there. So what I find is helpful is if you can put the blade parallel to the cutting table, and use your finger to kind of open up the seam allowance there so you can separate it, so you make sure you're not cutting into the quilt. And you can just keep cutting, and you're going to get a pretty good cut there, reducing the bulk of the seam allowance. You're just going to keep working your way all the way around the entire edge of the quilt until you get around to where you started. So a couple more little tricks before we turn it inside out. I like to cut off a little tiny bit of the corners, because when you turn it inside out, you're going to get some bulk there too. So don't get too close to the stitching, but maybe about 1/8 of an inch away, and just cut off the corners there. And then the other thing we're going to do is trim the edge of the batting down here by 1/4 of an inch with your scissors. And again, this can just be eyeballed. This will just help you be able to turn the quilt inside out with less bulk. So you're just making sure that it's just a little bit smaller. I find it a little harder, you know, when we do this, I thought about suggesting that you make it a 1/4 of an inch, make the batting 1/4 of an inch smaller, but it's really hard to reposition it. So I find it easier just to trim it off at the end. And you're making sure the whole time that you're not cutting into the fabric. And then we're going to turn it inside out. It's so satisfying when you get to this step. Okay. All right. Okay, now for the big reveal. So you're going to grab a corner, and you're going to pull it inside out. And you're going to see how great it's starting to look. Now this is when having that basting spray is really nice. Now, as you want to tease out these corners, because you want a really good corner there. So one thing you can do is get a chopstick inside, or you can also just take a pin and just kind of grab the corner with the pin and pull it out to make it just a little bit more, those corners a little bit sharper. Even that makes a big difference. And we'll do that to the other side as well. Now, because you just have 2 layers that you're dealing with, because you use that basting spray, the batting is adhering to the front of the quilt. So you're not going to have to worry about everything, all the layers kind of getting rumpled. And you'll find that there'll be some good friction that between the batting and the back of the quilt that will be really nice. Now you can see how this is just starting to lie really nice and flat. And as we have before, we're just going to work on one section of the quilt at a time. And what's fun about this technique, especially because it's a baby quilt, is that it's okay if you see a little of the back on the front. You can press it if you don't want to see any of the back, but as you quilt it, it's okay to see just a tiny bit of the backing fabric. So what you're going to do is start to smooth all of this out. And we're going to give it a press before we actually start quilting it. But you'll see now that it's going to look really nice and sharp as we move forward. And then once you've got this step done, you're going to be ready to quilt. Now, don't forget, we're going to have to hand sew the bottom as we after we finish quilting. And I like to wait until after we've finished quilting to hand sew, just in case there's any adjustment that happens when you're rolling up the quilt. So see how nice and clean this looks? It's a really great technique for a kind of a smoother, cleaner, modern finish. Okay, now when we get down to this end, can you see how we've got that 1/4 inch gap there? This is when you're going to wrap this around there, and you're going to fold this under, and you're going to have a nice clean edge. Takes a little bit of manipulating with the fingers, but then you have a nice clean edge, and you're going to pin this in place. And I like to sew it at the end after I've quilted it. You can sew it before if you want, but sometimes when you're rolling it, the layers move a little bit, and it's nice to be able to have a little wiggle room at the end. Okay, so we're wrapping that seam allowance around the batting. And we're just going to pin along the edge. And then I like to press it before I start quilting. And once you press it, you can actually take out the pins, so it's a little, you're not poking yourself quite as much. So typically, whether you're hand quilting or machine quilting, unless you're quilting on a long arm quilting machine, you generally want to start your quilting in the center. And the reason is, as you quilt, it pushes out the fabric a little bit at a time. And if you start at one end, you may end up warping the quilt. And being able to start your quilting in the middle of the quilt enables you to kind of split the difference in case there's any warping that happens as you roll the quilt, or even just if you have it in a hoop or whatever. It's just a smart strategy to typically start your quilting in the middle unless you're on a long arm quilting machine. So we're going to plan on starting, it doesn't have to be exactly the middle, but just to make it easier, we're going to start quilting right along the seam. So we're going to have to figure out how we're going to get all of this under the throat of the sewing machine. I'll show you how we're going to do this. And you can see I pressed the bottom, but I haven't sewn it yet. And we'll do that at the end. You can do it now if you want. I just find it a little bit easier to do at the end. So you're going to want to keep the back as flat as possible, and that is going to help you prevent you from getting tucks in the back. So I brought the quilt over to the sewing machine. You can see I still have my ironing board here because that's super helpful when you start to the quilting process. Now I like to use these finger cots to help push the kind of the friction that you get from them is really helpful. A friend of mine says that these are, bartenders use these when they've got a finger cut on their finger, if they're cutting lemons or whatever. I bought them, you can buy packs of 5. I don't feel like I need them on all my fingers, but I just find that the middle finger and the thumb are really helpful. When I'm working with this hand, I can hold the roll here that's going to be going under the sewing machine, so I don't feel like I need it on this finger, but see what works for you. The throat here of this sewing machine is the challenging part of machine quilting on a domestic machine. This is not a huge throat, but it also isn't a huge quilt, so this is why this is kind of doable. But you're going to want to roll up your quilt on each end, just so you can focus and have control over the part that you're quilting. Now we're going to go across in this wave pattern, and then when you get to the other side, you're going to turn the quilt and stitch a 1/2 inch and then go back in the other direction. So this is why it's helpful to have this. You're going to be turning this a lot, and this is why it's helpful to have this rolled up in as small a footprint as possible, because you're going to be turning it underneath the machine as well. So take a deep breath, let's get going. And we're going to start right at the seam line. And these wave patterns are very much like handwriting, that you're going to, that what really matters is consistency more than anything. So we've got our feed dogs up. You'll hear a lot about feed dogs up or feed dogs down when you're doing machine quilting, because this pattern is pretty much a straight pattern with a few little curves. You will keep your feed dogs up. Usually you drop your feed dogs. Some people like to, not everybody. If you're going in a pattern that's moving around a little bit more and you need to move the quilt forward and backward, the feed dogs are useful to have down if that's your direction. However, what's nice about having them up is it regulates the length of your stitch. So especially for beginner quilters, that takes one more concern out of the equation for you. So keep the feed dogs up, and we're just going to do a gentle wave, staying, within distance of that seam, so you make sure you're going to be straight. And we have our chalk lines there too to make sure we don't get lost. And then when you go back on the second pass, you're going to be using the outside of the walking foot edge or whatever marker you want to be able to make the next line and make it pretty consistent. So let's get going. I'm going to do a couple of tacking stitches, and you can see I've got this kind of thrown over my shoulder, and I've got the sewing machine for when we start to unroll this thing and it gets a little less compact. So I'm going to needle down, reverse stitch, just do a couple of little tacking stitches to get going, and then we're off to the races. I should say I've lengthened my stitch length to about a number 3. I find when you're doing machine quilting, you're going through all those layers, so the stitches feel a little bit shorter. Some people like a longer stitch, some people a shorter, but I think 3 is probably about right for this. So you can see it's really useful to have, there's a little bit of drag because of all these layers, so to have this little sticky bit on your hands is kind of helpful. And you're going to be smoothing as you go to make sure that the area that you're quilting stays nice and flat. And then when you get to the edge, you're going to needle down. And let's see, we're going to put it down. We're going to move it this way. And just sew about 1/2 inch. Put your needle down again and swing it on around. And now we're ready for the next pass. And we're just going to keep going until we get to one end, and then we're going to turn around and start from the middle and go toward the other side as well. So now I've got this wave stitch here, and I'm going to use the outside of the pressure foot to make sure that I'm getting a nice line. It's pretty similar. And you can see I'm just tracing that edge of the seam I just sewed. But this is a very forgiving stitch. So don't worry if it looks, you get off track. As long as you stay consistent, you're good. Then needle down and pull this in. So just let me trim these seams, these threads there. And we're going to go just 1/2 inch in, needle down, and turn it in again. And now we're going to be using the other side of this presser foot as your guideline. We're halfway there. So you can see I've quilted this part of it. This is the part that I'm going to hand sew, and I'm going to do one last stitching run after that. So I stopped just a little bit short of that, and I'm going to go back after I've trimmed and make sure everything is all good to go there. But in the meantime, I'm going to roll this section up and finish this last section, and then it's ready for the wash. But let me show you what I've done. So the secret to this stitching is consistently inconsistent. So you want it to look very easy and relaxed, and you'll notice that it comes and goes. It doesn't have to be perfect. In fact, it's a little bit easier and more forgiving if you're not trying to make it perfect. So just focus on generally getting the distance right and the general curves right. But again, the baby who receives it isn't going to care at all whether your stitching is perfect, and the people who receive it are going to be just so thrilled and touched that you made it for them. So if you can turn off that inner critic, you'll be a happier quilter for sure. Okay, we're done. I love it, and I hope you do too. We had an easy time, I hope, doing the quilting, and so now we like to put our quilts in the wash and put a label on it and press it before we give it to the recipients. But I hope you enjoyed making this quilt with me, and you will like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.